For me, it's very important to say very nice words in the beginning. I would like to say happy 20th anniversary to AUTOSAR from the Eclipse Foundation community, automotive community. And the title is SDV, right? But I would like to make one point very clear, and I'm not sure if anyone is aware of it. The Eclipse Foundation was founded 1 year after AUTOSAR, and ever since then, there's a close relation between AUTOSAR and the Eclipse Foundation, because RTOP is built on Eclipse IDE and other stuff, which is developed under the umbrella of the Eclipse Foundation. And what's interesting to see, right? The one is RTOP you're aware of, and there's a layer below. There's a project called Sphinx. And what's interesting right now, what we see, there's a new increased interest of organizations to continue to develop this one. A couple of people say Eclipse ID, that's this very old UI and it's not very modern any longer. And exactly this is what currently a couple of organizations think through Renew, for example, because the Eclipse IDE is still basic for a lot of things, not only RTOP. For example, the complete SAP ABAP software development processes are based on the Eclipse IDE. So the group of organizations you can see below, and a couple of them are maybe quite famous from the automotive space, are now coming together to think about how to improve the Eclipse IDE. And I think we heard about the AUTOSAR opening strategy earlier today, and that maybe also include open source. And you should not forget that tooling is also quite important step to do these kind of things. So it doesn't make sense to have an open source basic software which cannot be configured by an open source tooling. So maybe the one or the other organization would be interested also to learn more about this and maybe even join. There will be a hackathon on July 5th in Walldorf at SAP, where we talk and do this kind of coding for Eclipse IDE. There will be a couple of other things ongoing, especially on the EclipseCon later this year in October in Ludwigsburg. So whoever's interested, just reach out to me. So the community is currently reassembling to do new stuff, maybe to have a much more modern design for Eclipse IDE for the user interface. If you would like to be part of that story, please just reach out to me, and I think the community would highly appreciate this one. But I'm here today to talk about the software-defined vehicle. Over the last 15 months, I had a couple of discussions about software and automotive, and there were so many people saying, yeah, automotive, they cannot develop software. And I think I would claim it completely differently. If you can look at the number of incidents and accidents over the last 20 years, there's a clear decrease. At the same time, the complexity in the software was increasing. So there seems to be some relation between the cars getting more and more secure and the software getting more and more complex. So I think that's good, and honestly, I think AUTOSAR has been part of that deal that cars became more secure and to get into that situation. But although that's the bad part of the story, the software complexity will increase over the next years even more, right? So don't get me wrong, the absolute figures are not so much of interest. I think everyone can agree that the complexity of software will increase by a new factor of 3 or 5 for the future. And not sure, I think I haven't been on a conference where people said, yeah, we hire 5,000 engineers, we hire 10,000 software engineers. That's an interesting concept. I'm not 100% sure if that could work. Maybe there are other ideas how to get and to master that complexity. The ugly part of automotive software, especially maybe for most of the people in the room, is safety has become a hygienic factor. So in the past, 10 years ago, you could sell a car with a 5-star NCIP test. Nowadays, you can't sell a car without a 5-star NCIP test. So all the effort spent in the automotive industry to provide secure and safe software is something which a customer just expects today. Nobody would say, hey, I buy a car because it's safe. That's a mandatory precondition to sell a car. And that's something which really makes the automotive industry struggling, because the software features where a car is bought for by end customer today usually has nothing to do with safety and security. Security perhaps, but not with safety. And that's the part where the automotive industry is maybe not at the forefront of development. And here comes the critical slide that I have to say, sorry, right? So what we claim to be, or to start collaboration with SDV, but there has been successful collaboration formats in the past as well, right? We learned AUTOSAR has been founded 20 years ago. That was 2002, right? There was no iPhone in 2002. There was no Kubernetes. There was no CNCF in 2002. So it's an very old organization, very successful. And I forgot this in my intro, right? Because at least I feel that I have been part of that success story. I worked a couple of years for Electrobit, and I was responsible for selling AUTOSAR software stacks. And I can tell you that was not always easy, because purchasing guys said, why do I have to pay it again? It's a standard. Why would I need to buy over and over software stacks? And as there's one point here, standard adopt to OEM needs. That's a similar story, right? So then I go to the purchasing guys of the tier one, and they said, Michael, why do I have to buy a BMW stack? And why do I have to buy a VW stack? And why do I have to buy a Mercedes stack? I thought that's a standard, right? But at the end of the day, the standardization had a couple of challenges because the OEMs was not necessarily always willing to adapt their systems and their specifications. So we found a lot of OEM-specific parts in AutoSAR, which was not always easy. The more principal things, and that was when I listened to the presentations today, standardization has the problem of that it is consensus-driven. And what that means, usually the slowest member can have an influence on the speed on how fast standards are finally approved and other things. That means, it takes time to make a standard, right? And if you look at other modern technologies like cloud technology, AI, there's hardly any standard. Software becomes a de facto standard by adoption. People decide to use. Kubernetes is not standardized. There is no ISO norm for Kubernetes. And if anyone knows differently, please correct me. But according to my knowledge, there is no ISO standard or WCC standard or anything else for Kubernetes. The same is true for AI stuff like TensorFlow or PyTorch or the algorithms which they implement. So obviously the prevailing model of development and collaboration has changed from standardization, where we have been huge success in the European industry, at least for the last 100 years, and has been much more replaced by starting with implementation and de facto standardization by adoption. So that means when we started with the SDV development, and when I say we, it's not that I was a brilliant mind behind that one, but was always driven by the community discussion. We said we would like to do a couple of things differently. We do not want to start with architecture. We do not want to start with specification. We want to start with implementation. We call this code first. A couple of people complain would be better named implementation first, but we called it code first. So what we did over the first year, we asked each and every organization, what software can you contribute? So it's not about, I think Robert just presented a very, how I would call it in English, a solid, a closed technical solution, which is great, right? We have a different approach. We say, what is there? So we do not have this, we started intentionally technology-wise on the greenfield. We said, if we decide for certain technologies, there may be 50% of companies out there say, we cannot join because that special technology is used. Like you talked about containerization. There are a couple of people saying you cannot use Docker-D or something, it's too complex for cars, right? They talk about maybe other container formats. And so we would have said we use that container format. There may be 50% of the companies out there saying, oh, no, unfortunately, we think that's not good, and we would like to not to support this one. So we plan not to be consensus-driven. What does that mean? We talk about distributions at software-defined vehicle. That means at the end of the day, hopefully, we will have not the one and single SDV distributions, or we will have a couple of distributions, and we may have two projects which do absolutely the same. There's one project which is used in distribution A, there's another project used in distribution B, and that would be completely fine for us. So we do not need to consent and compromise, which also means we do not have the same speed for each and every one. So if a group of organizations decide to run faster, why not? So as long as they do then finally the modification to the project, if they work in an upstream first manner, all community members can finally participate if a group of people work faster or a group of organizations faster than the others. Can you switch to the next slide? Obviously. There anyone who could press the key on the, no, that was too many slides. Just, no, next one? No? Next one. No, one. Now we should just keep that one. So one of the things which makes it maybe valuable to work under the umbrella of an open source foundation is we start with a couple of principles. I have another slide which explains this a little bit later, more in detail on a general level. But for SDV, we defined right from the beginning a couple of principles we really try to follow. The first one already mentions we are code first. So we really try to start with implementation. And you said, Robert, something where people can play with, right? It's not just paperwork or slide work. It's really something people can get hands on, download, modify, upload. The projects are self-governing to enable community-driven success. That means we talk about the SDV working group. It's important to understand the concept. We have on the one side the working group. The working group is responsible for cross-project alignment, for timelines, for feature wishes. It's responsible for marketing of technologies, going to conference and other things. But the projects which are associated with the working groups, which finally implements the software which builds SDV, they are independent, so as self-governing. So the question is now, if you have 50 projects, how would you be able to align them to make a similar release, simultaneous release? And in fact, I introduced the Eclipse IDE. The Eclipse IDE consists of 60 different projects, and we build since years. They're what we call simultaneous releases, and we never missed a deadline to release an Eclipse IDE version every quarter. So there's obviously, even open source, the chance and ways to orchestrate and to synchronize a huge amount of different projects to get in time into a release. Aim for success by selecting robust, sustainable, and well-engineered projects. That means we think about projects will be chosen finally on the quality by adoption, not by the specification upfront, but really projects has to prove their value so that they can finally make it into a distribution. We will not act as kingmakers. As I said, if we have competing projects, we would be absolutely fine with this. And if we have two competing projects, there are two options, right? Or three options. They can coexist. They can decide to work together to build something better together. Or there's just a winner-takes-it-all approach. So if one project is much more adopted than the others, because the community decides that this is the technology to go, that's the case. Why not, right? But we would not decide this upfront, but we would the community have this decided by adoption. We do not want to reinvent the wheel. I have a couple of slides on this one later, but this is exactly why we're talking here today with Sophie, with Autosar, with Covisa. No single stack, I mentioned that one. Define specification, drive for open source projects, which are demonstrated broad adoption and real-world use. That's what was, again, fitting to the code first. It's not about starting with specification and see if it works. We say we use projects, and if these projects are well adopted and mature, we can just use the API for specification. Why would we need something else if there's already something which is proven and well used? We want to build automotive-grade software, and I'm sure maybe, or not I'm sure, but in a couple of my presentations, people ask, yeah, does that work for ASIL-D? I just learned today that there's an AWI, I think accepted work item for the ISO 26262, which now wants to deal with how to integrate existing software components into an ISO 26262 framework. I think that's work we just started, but it's quite interesting because that would exactly be the thing we would need with software-defined vehicle to make a project which is developed in open source, use an ISO 26262 environment. By the way, I also heard from a different project that are currently talking about something which is called continuous safety certification. So the idea is that there's not one monolithic single project, this is once certified, but that this certification based on new updates is continuously ongoing, which would make it much easier and hopefully much more efficient and cheaper to deal with the real software world, right? Because it's usually not the way how software works, that there's one version which is certified, and then there are no changes, no update to that software. So obviously a couple of interesting concepts and interesting discussions around the ISO 26262 to extend these to more software-driven development processes. And finally, we are here to help our projects. What does that mean? So our working group, if you would like to become a member, usually you have to pay a fee, and the fee is not just for paying for my vacation, but the fee is mainly for, we have, for example, now 4 people on staff, a program manager, a marketing manager, we have a process engineer. We support the projects with, do a lot of pre-work which is needed to use projects, maybe according to MISRA or SPICE or ISO 26262. We'll have a technical writer because project adoption depends on good and high frequency updated documentation. So having this kind of support for the projects will help the projects to become better and to be easier adopted from the community. Next slide, please. Important to understand, we understand ourselves as a B2B open source organization. We not claim everything needs to be open source. That's not the case. But if you remember the complexity slide I showed previously, one of the measures to deal with the complexity is collaboration. And why would you not be willing to collaborate on the non-differentiating part of the software stack? I think there's obviously a study from Capgemini stating that there are 61 different middleware versions. Why would you need 61 different middleware versions? Will we be able to reduce this to one? Most likely not. Would it make sense to reduce them to 5 different versions? Most likely yes, because complexity increases. Where do you get the software developers from? Wouldn't it make sense to try to collaborate in the non-differentiating part and focus the remaining software developers on the part where you can earn money? That's at least a couple of our organizations or the organization our communities think about, but it's not easy really to define the value lines. So a couple of organizations have different understandings of value lines, what could be the area of collaboration, what not, and these are quite interesting discussion we have right now. So we started just 12 months ago, now a bit about 14 months ago, and ARM was also one of the founding members at the very beginning, so all the clear demonstrating that there is a close connection between the different organizations. Today we are 36, no 38. Just yesterday we had 2 more members signing the documents. So we currently grow with a rate of 1 new member every 2 weeks. We are very happy to just welcome GM and LGE as our first Korean member. So we are on a strong growth here. Yeah, so it seems that we're at least onto something and that most of these members are quite supportive for what we are doing. Scope, as I said, we don't have the broad technology. I cannot come up on stage and say, this is what we like to do, these are the APIs, these are the areas. We have a very broad scope, right? We just define 3 areas. We define the software in the car, we define the software in the cloud, and for me, very important, the tooling. When I started my presentation, I talked about the Eclipse ID in a completely different context, but that's exactly where we think that collaboration is also key for the complete industry. And for example, in the number of projects, there's a project by Carriot called RHE, which is a project which would, at the end of the day, generate AUTOSAR RXML files to configure AUTOSAR stacks. So there's a lot of things ongoing also in this tooling space to collaborate in the open. As of today, we have onboarded 20 different projects. These are just 19, but the 20th is just out and I was not able to update the slides on time. Just to give you a rough overview where these concepts are, we heard already about the Chariot project. We have a couple of others. We have Heimling, for example. That's a hardware security module with a lot of series-ready implementation for security function and cryptographic functions, for example. We have projects on the runtime level, on the orchestration management level, on the application development level, up to the tooling. And interestingly, we already have AUTOSAR-related projects. There's this ambient light service, which is a classic AUTOSAR application. We have the ADAAA, the autonomous driving adaptive AUTOSAR application. Unfortunately, we do not have the source code for now. And that's not because the initial contributor do not want to contribute the source code. It's what we heard today. We are talking about IP issues with AUTOSAR. It's not that that AUTOSAR already said we will sue you, but it's based on the IP discussion we have. And most of the members who are contributing AUTOSAR projects are all the members of AUTOSAR. They are aware of the IP policy issues we have right now. And so we have a very intense discussion with the AUTOSAR board how we may be able to solve this one. Then there's a project, I already mentioned, the RHE by Carriot, and there's at least one, there's the Summer project, that's a some IP implementation in Rust. So we have out of the 20 or 4 or 5 projects already have a direct AUTOSAR connection, and 2 of them are currently not onboarded because of this IP discussion issues between AUTOSAR and open source. Just 2 examples, Eclipse and Kaios, that's the last 2 contributions. That's a project which is contributed by Electrobit. That's about a container orchestration for automotive high-performance computers and programmed in Rust. And then we have the MU protocol by GM. So GM not just joined as a member of the SDV. As said, they brought a component called MU protocol, which is a communication protocol between our car and the cloud. And yeah, so it was just recently added. And GM now hopes that this was also then used by competitors as it is open source project. Oh, I just want to go back 1 slide for the overview. 1 project I forgot is Eclipse Cuxa. Eclipse Cuxa builds on top of the Covisa vehicle signal specification. So even today, we already have this close collaboration between AUTOSAR, Covisa, SOFI, and the SDV working group. Yeah, the state of open source. Where are we? How are companies willing to support us? So 20 years ago, automotive industry just denied that there's open source. And that was mainly the legal departments and compliance topics. We cannot do open source, we have obligations where we cannot sue anyone for any infringement and other things. Then for a very long time, we are in the area of using open source. Everyone knows if you just go into your car and just look for the license splash screen on your head unit, you can see 100 software programs and libraries usually with their according open source licenses. And now we talk, and then first companies start to contribute. It's interesting to see now companies come up with an open source manifesto. The Mercedes just published. I think Conti, I know a couple of people, Conti are here, just published their open source manifesto. Bosch has something similar. So most of these companies now developing from even using to contributing and even more see open source as a strategic part of their business strategy. Here's something which is very important to understand. People talk about open source. Honestly, that's bullshit. Open source is by way not enough, because if you look into the definition of open source, it just makes assumption on the third column, which is called adoption. So you can have an open source project, which is completely open source, and have an evil dictator on the contribution, on the collaboration level. So having the project open source does not necessarily mean that it's something good, because open source does not define the collaboration, and open source also does not define the contribution part. So it could be, as I said, there's someone who controls everything, lets nobody else participate in any kind of decision, what features, what timing, what else. But still, as long as the artifacts are available under an open source license, you can call it with all rights open source. If you look at AUTOSAR, you can find AUTOSAR in this picture as well. AUTOSAR is not open source, so the results of open source AUTOSAR are not freely available for everyone. It's just limited to the AUTOSAR members. But the collaboration is open. Everyone, and please correct me if I'm wrong, everyone can be part of the AUTOSAR consortium. There's no exclusion. Nobody says you are not allowed to join AUTOSAR. And the way to collaborate is very well defined, right? The IP policy is there, the antitrust policy is there. So AUTOSAR is a very successful open collaboration. Unfortunately, the results, the final results, are not open available to everyone. And what we try to do as an open source foundation, we try to cover all the three pillars. We try to cover the adoption pillar. That means all the things which are developed under the umbrella of the Eclipse Foundation are open source. We try to provide the governance framework, that we have a clear, vendor-neutral, open, transparent collaboration model, and we have a fair contribution model. That means most of the organization, or all of the organizations, keep most of the IP rights for their contributions so that they can have an influence on their IP in the future as well. We'll skip this one. So we are the new kid on the block. I said one of our core principles, don't reinvent the wheel. And most of the things you already heard today, so I will go very fast with this one. You saw an earlier version of that slide today where just Covisa and AUTOSAR was listed. Fortunately, the AUTOSAR colleagues already had a more elaborated version. And so you can see this one. And Sophie's also there, and a couple of different other organizations like Kronos and GaiaX, GaTinaX, very interesting. I have one slide on this one later on. The ASAM was mentioned today. And I see the software-defined vehicle at the Eclipse Foundation as the initiative of initiatives. Not in the sense from one initiative to rule them all, that's not the idea, but we are at the end of the day the one, because we are a general purpose organization, right? We don't have a one technical topic. We try to combine everything into one usable stack for the software developer who is responsible for developing finally the end customer function. And I think that's, so, you know, AUTOSAR, don't get me wrong, is not important. Covisa is not important. We are not important. Only if the developers who finally need to develop the functions which then finally motivates the car buyer to buy the car, they are important, that we provide them a platform which is easy to use and acceptable. Just the examples where we have very tight discussion with AUTOSAR on this IP usage topics. We learned already, or mentioned already, that CUXA is building on top of the vehicle signal specification from Covisa. Robert already mentioned that Eclipse Chariot can be run on top of the edge workload abstraction orchestration layer. So there's all these kind of things working together. And if you look at the members, most of the members are identical in all of these three organizations. So it's not that we have different subsets of automotive companies, but at the end of the day, the driving and the main members in our organizations are quite similar. That's a very interesting thing. We did not address this today. And I think it's really important. We talked about complexity, increase of complexity. That means we need more developers. How do we as an automotive industry attract developers? If you as a new student would like to work with cloud, you can work with Kubernetes. It's the same software. 3 years later, you can work in a real job at a company. If you are an AI enthusiast, you can work with TensorFlow or PyTorch. And 3 years later, when you go to the company, you can work with the same software and directly use your knowledge. If you would like to do automotive, bad luck, there's nothing or hardly anything. Yeah, there's RTOP. And maybe your professor has a relation to Electrobit or Vector or KPIT or wherever, and you have access. But if you, to be honest, there's hardly any real good, serious quality software, open source software out there where a software developer could be attracted to automotive software. There's an initiative, a non-profit initiative, which initially started in France called 42. And the idea of 42 is that they train software developers not on a regular, not in the same way as at universities are doing it, but the idea here is that experienced software developers help new starters to become software developers. And this initiative is very much supported by VW, Microsoft, Bosch. Again, a little bit the same members as with all the other initiatives. And we signed a partnership agreement with them. And the idea is here, we try to build our own community. If we can make these students work on our open source software, our open source software makes to the serious development, these students can directly start in their company with the knowledge which they can directly use for software development. I think that's a very interesting aspect, and I think among technical people, it's not very well understood, not very well driven, that we need software developers to master the complexity. And I can tell you the automotive industry, there's a couple of studies there, is most likely not the most attractive employer for software developers. And I think one of the reasons is you cannot get access to interesting software when you're at the university, not already working for an automotive company. So what we are doing mainly, and just very short on this one, as I said, we started in 2022. We ran a couple of events there. The first events were titled Contribution Days because the main purpose was to collect all the projects I showed previously. Then we had one big hackathon at the BCX with about 100 people on site. The interesting story here, and just to tell that anecdote, right? The Bosch Connected World is one of the main custom events of Bosch. And one of our data suppliers was a truck by Conti with a huge Conti logo on the truck. And then there was discussion, I at least heard about this one, that the Bosch management initially said, we cannot have a Conti truck at our main custom event. And then other people at Bosch said, if we really believe in our story that we need to collaborate among the automotive industry, it would be a very bad sign that we, at the very first occasion where we could stick to that statement, would say no. So finally, this truck was available on this Bosch event, which was very, very interesting to see that really there seems to be people start to rethink how collaboration could look like in the automotive industry. A couple of pictures. That was our first contribution day at the ZF headquarters in Friedrichshafen. That was the second one at T-Systems headquarters in Bonn. This video will not run because it's just a PDF. And that's the planning for this year. We had the first community day. So we changed the concept from contribution from new projects to community, building communities, motivating the different projects to work together, because we have nothing won if we have 50 brilliant projects, but the projects are not fitting together to build a stack. So now we are working on how we can help the projects to work together. We talk about concepts like exchange hostages, so that different project needs to send one of their developers to other projects just to make sure that the connections are there. One event now in just about 4 weeks, I have another slide on this one, the Automotive Open Source Summit, which is quite interesting. And if you are interested, just make sure that you would be in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I truly believe we can have brilliant technology, brilliant software, will still fail because the whole industry needs to change its mindset. I'm not saying that we can, from an automotive, from open source perspective, can change completely or drive this change, but I think at least we can contribute by addressing topics like liability, total cost of ownership, these kind of how does open source fits into my product development process and other things. And that's the topic which is not handled on developers level. That's a topic which is handled on management level. So we decided to have this kind of management meeting where we would like to discuss these kind of things, what would be to be changed in the automotive industry to become more closer to software development concepts. That's what I mean with more than just software. We have this nice, so if you're there, just reach out to me or look on the website. This event will, as I said, happen in about 4 weeks from now in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Munich. These are the topics. As I said, there's a website. Look at this one, please. Maybe as a final remark, the automotive industry is not only undergoing this change in the direction of open source for the software in the car. People tend to think that the only area where software is used. The same happens, interestingly, right now with the supply chain. There's this huge Catena-X. I'm not sure if you've heard about here in the US about Catena-X. Catena-X is a public-funded, German public-funded project, about 150 million euro funding. 28 organizations, among them BMW, Mercedes, Bosch, Conti, SAP, a couple of other big suppliers. And the idea is here to build an open source supply chain solution. They defined about 10 use cases like carbon dioxide footprinting, supplier data management, there's a new law in Germany, supply chain law, so that all the companies are obliged to track the supply chain. And so finally, companies decided to work together on this one. That's a huge project with a couple of hundred developers right now, and it's open source by intention. So what the automotive industry said, if we would like to work together, usually public funding, and working together means pre-competition area. If you do these things in open source, you can do this all in the competition area, because if you openly distribute all the results, you can comply with antitrust laws, even if you collaborate in the competitive area. So Catena-X is one of these examples. Another one is IDTA, the Industrial Digital Twin Association. So in Germany, there's since a couple of years an initiative called Platform Industry 4.0, which tries to bring the shop floor IT to the next level. And digital twin is a huge topic here, and there's a software component which is called Asset Administration Shell, which implements this digital twin. And again, this is an open source project, meanwhile, under the umbrella of the Eclipse Foundation. So if you look at it, the software in the car, plus cloud backend, plus enabling features, the software from the supply chain and general purpose IT, and the software, shop floor, OT software, how they call it, everything is now has a huge push into open source. And I think I started my presentation with the idea of collaboration. So it seemed that this industry-wide collaboration and doing this together in open source gains more and more momentum, not only for what we are doing in AutoSAS, software-defined vehicle, but for the other areas as well. So thank you very much. If there's any interest in SDV, just reach out to me. I think we have very interesting discussions right now, at least among the organizations, and I hope that we can continue this one and also come up with concrete results in the next time on this one.